Welcome to our podcast, Journey into the Future of Medicine. I'm your host, Bill Maggio, Chief Executive Officer of the Jacobs Institute. We are a nonprofit medical device innovation center here in Buffalo, New York. Here we talk about what is possible in the next quarter century of medicine and healthcare, based on a report we published titled The Future of Medicine. Due to COVID-19, this episode was recorded through an online platform, which accounts for differences in sound quality. Stephen Galster is an environmental and human rights investigator and counter-trafficking program designer. He has conducted investigations and remedial programs to stop wildlife trafficking and human trafficking and to build good governance around these issues in Asia, Africa, and North America. Stephen is currently serving as a director and co-founder of Freeland, a nonprofit organization fighting against wildlife trafficking and human slavery. Throughout the COVID-19 global crisis, he has become a strong and sought-after advocate for a global wildlife trade ban and an educator on wet markets and zoonotic diseases, or diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans. He has been featured recently on CNN, National Geographic, Discovery, and journals like Time Magazine and the New York Times. Stephen, welcome, and I believe you're coming to us from Thailand today. Is that correct?
That's right. Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
It's a great privilege to have you with us today. Some may recall, and I want to thank you again for serving as a speaker this past September in our Future Medicine webinar event. We're happy, very, very happy that you're able to join us again today to discuss zoonotics and I'm sure a variety of other topics that will come up during the course of our conversation. So to get started, for our listeners who may not know, can you just start out by defining what is zoonotics?
Well, zoonotic simply means transmission from an animal to a person. So a zoonotic disease would be something that transmitted from an animal to a person. It could be from a wild animal directly to a person. It could be from a domesticated animal that caught it from a wild animal and then transmitted to a person.
You know, you helped develop an organization called Freeland. Can you tell, just to set the stage here, can you tell us a little about what Freeland does?
Sure. We're an international civil society organization, and we focus on trafficking. We're trying to make the world free of wildlife trafficking and human slavery. And that means that we are building up defense systems at the international and local levels to stop those forms of trafficking, to fight corruption, and to build up good governance. And that comes down to helping police and customs and national park rangers, stop poachers and traffickers after trees, animals, and people. And it means also doing behavior change programs, raising awareness about the, what drives these black market commerce. I mean, in the end, it's demand. So we work both ends of that.
Are wildlife trafficking and human slavery big issues in the United States, you think, today? I mean, this is fascinating to me.
Oh, yeah, very big. These are hidden diseases, if you will. So the United States, people don't realize, is the second biggest importer of wildlife in the world. And that means, in a lot of the legal trade in wild animals, whether it's live animals or trophies or whatever, it masks also an illegal trade, and it can mask viruses too. Human trafficking, huge around the world, more slaves in the world today than there ever were. In the United States, just like any rich country, is part of that too.
So sad to hear. Our Future Medicine report, which is really what we're here to talk about, predicted a global pandemic in the chapter Pandemics Arms Race. We've talked a lot about this in our past podcasts this year. We know that an increase in global population, high rates of travel, climate change have had an influence on this. But looking at the pandemic from your unique perspective, what are some of the other factors that contributed to the COVID-19 outbreak?
Well, we see two main drivers causing these pandemics. We're talking going back to HIV, Ebola, SARS, MERS, bird flu, now COVID-19. These are all, zoonotic-based pandemics. The two things that that cause them the most. One is destruction of wild animal habitat. That's the push factor. Whenever that happens, when we're tearing down trees or moving farms next to a national park, or any kind of disturbance of wild habitat, is going to push those wild animals into closer contact with people, or into closer contact with pigs, or whatever it is you're put next to them. And then they can shed viruses that'll jump to people. The second most efficient driving factor causing these outbreaks is commercial trade in wild animals, where we pull those animals out of their natural homes and put them into direct contact with people because we're eating them or selling them, or wildlife markets, etc. Like what happened with SARS. That was those were civet cats, raccoon-like species that were sold on menus coming from wildlife farms. And we're still not sure about COVID-19, whether it was a pangolin or a bat from a wet market, or something that was sold or leaked from a lab. We may never know, but what we do know is these were zoonotic outbreaks, and the two most efficient ways of sparking such pandemics is destroying wild habitat and trading in wild animals.
When you say could have leaked from a lab, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, in what context are you referring?
Well, I mean, most scientists. So first of all, I'm not making slight of, but I am. We have to consider all theories, even the conspiracy theories. And my point to people is, it doesn't really matter whether it was a bat from a lab, or a pangolin from a market, or a combination of the two. What matters is it was a zoonotic outbreak, and those two drivers I mentioned are what caused them. We need to, come up with a vaccine, of course, and it's great they've done that, but we're going to be right back here where we were again in a couple of years, or maybe sooner, maybe longer, unless we treat the root cause of these pandemics. As long as we don't do that, we're just going to be putting expensive Band-Aids on the problem and have recurring pandemics. But most scientists do believe that the virus can be traced back to a horseshoe bat. In many cases, bats are the original sort of vector for various reasons. But again, whether it was a market, a lab, whatever, those bats, if it was a bat, they did not fly to that lab freely on their own. Somebody would have pulled them from their natural habitat, or in many cases of medical laboratory situations, medical teams may or may not pull those animals out of their habitat on their own for experiments. They may buy them from traders. We know a lot of wildlife traders around the world. Part of their market is medical labs.
This may sound like an absurd question, but just trying to follow what you're saying here. If we were to shut down the global wet market trade, could we potentially eradicate future pandemics?
So, well, first of all, if we could ban the commercial trade in wild animals, we would seriously reduce the intensity and recurrence of pandemics. Definitely, and that's, we need to do that for a lot of reasons. We're going through the fastest rate of species loss ever in history, which is bad for our environment. Zoonotic outbreaks are just, the extreme response to this cascading failure of the environment right now. So, but just to clarify, wet markets are basically, produce markets, like outdoor, kind of almost vegetable markets also. So just to clarify, in China, they've got wet markets that some have wild animals in them, some don't. So we always refer to it as wildlife markets.
Understood. So I would imagine that part of the reason why people aren't paying close attention to this, or at least haven't up to this point, maybe they will now that this has had such a huge impact on the global economy. I would imagine that the reason that we don't talk about this is because this is a big market. It's billions and billions of dollars, and people just don't want to give it up. Would that be an accurate statement for me to make?
Yes, money talks. This trade, legal and illegal combined, is hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So you can imagine when you start talking about banning this trade, that certain forces speak up, and some of them are connected to powerful people. Some are powerful people in their own right. So that's what we're up against, is money.
Can you give me just while we're on this topic, can you give me examples of other contagious viruses that have originated from animals just in the last half century, I suppose?
Yeah, sure. Well, HIV. So that would have
Right.
been, from primates. Ebola, probably a combination of bats to primates. MERS, probably a combination of bats and camels. Bird flu, migratory waterfowl mixed with domesticated birds. And the list goes on. And then, of course, with the original COVID of this century, which was SARS, that was civet cats, also with a potential connection to bats. And now, of course, we've got COVID-19.
So, Stephen, a lot of people have said that SARS was much more lethal than COVID-19. But is that really the case, in your opinion?
Technically, SARS was more lethal because there was a 10% fatality rate, as opposed to the 1 to 2% fatality rate in COVID-19. They're both coronaviruses, but one is spreading more globally than the other, so the numbers are up. And 1 to 2% of millions and millions of people is kills more people, obviously, than 10% of just tens of thousands. And they never did come up with a final vaccine for SARS, and they were on their way to doing that, probably. But by the time that it cost a lot of money, as this one has, and by the time that they were getting perhaps close, the epidemic was over. So that research was shelved, and we saw money going into that was reduced. Probably wasn't smart. And of course, as I said before, we didn't really treat the origin as seriously. So I think we need to do both. We need to be developing vaccines, but we need to also jump ahead and stop this from happening again through prevention. We need to also understand that bats are super important to our ecosystems. So we got to make sure that bats don't become the villain. The Chinese went out and killed a bunch of civets after SARS because they thought that's what made everybody sick. That's not the answer. The answer is not to kill all these animals. It's to recognize that their role in the ecosystem is super important. And that's what's really leading to these zoonotic outbreaks, is when you remove these species from their natural homes, leave them in their natural homes where they perform really important ecosystem services for all of us. And we're fine. It's the moment that you take them out, push or pull them out of their natural homes, that's when trouble happens. We need to leave Mother Nature alone, protect her, and she'll protect us.
Pushing by changing the environmental landscape, and pulling by putting them in these wet markets. Totally understand.
This is something that we should all be quite concerned about, because parallel to what's happening with people, we're seeing these viruses mutate in wildlife farms, something that we've been very concerned about. And these are not all exactly the same virus. They're coronaviruses. And I think the main point here to remember is that there's so much that we don't know about these viruses, and they can mutate. And as we furiously go after a vaccine, these vaccines that we're going to spend a lot of time and money on may not work against the next viral strain. And so we really need to be addressing the root cause of these outbreaks.
So I get this question a lot in talking to some of my colleagues about the fact that I was going to be having the pleasure to speak to you today. Could this have been prevented from becoming a global pandemic? I mean, what steps could have been taken? You use COVID too, and I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with that as I am 19, obviously, but could this have been prevented from becoming a global pandemic? Are there steps that China could have taken that they didn't take? Set aside politics for a second, to prevent this from becoming a global pandemic?
Yes, I think so. I think we could have seriously mitigated the risk, and we have the chance to do it again if we learn lessons. China closed wildlife markets after COVID-2, but then they reopened them. They said, okay, we just got to regulate them better. And clearly that didn't work. So what did we see after COVID-19? They closed the wildlife markets again. This time they said, we're going to go further and make sure people don't eat wildlife. And that's their new law in China. And it's still being, fought because of all the money involved. And it's being watered down. It's still not perfect. But the fact that the Chinese government is telling people not to eat wildlife anymore in the face of a $74 billion a year industry domestically in that country alone tells you something. And so the rest of the world needs to take note of what the Chinese have learned and what they're doing. And we need to replicate that practice actually and shut down the markets despite how much money they make, because they are one of the most efficient ways to transmit viruses. Second thing we need to learn is that we need to invest much more in nature preservation and nature protection, because as I said before, the other contributing factor is the destruction of habitat.
Sure.
And what we really need to be thinking about here is, an insurance package for the planet and investing in planetary health. And there is a term, as you know, called One Health, which is being pushed by the World Health Organization and the UN, which basically says we got to take care of people, animals, and ecosystems at the same time. Otherwise, this is going to happen again.
I was going to ask you just what the One Health approach is. And can you go a little bit deeper on that for me? Because I'm fascinated by that. What exactly is the One Health approach?
I mean, it's pretty simple, really. It's just, most governments are siloed. You've got your Ministry of Health or Food and Drug Administration and, ministries of environment, or in the United States, we call them, secretaries of Interior, et cetera. It's basically getting them all to work together on one policy and one approach that brings together the protection of, the environment, along with animals, including wild animals and domesticated animals, along with people. Because if you separate those three, you end up missing virus jumps. You end up reacting to disease outbreaks. By bringing those three sectors together and having experts from the environment, human health, and animal health talk to each other and essentially knit their policies together, you prevent disease outbreaks. Because somewhere between 60 and 70% of emerging infection diseases are zoonotic.
Fascinating to me. It really is. So this is not, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is not about regulating wet markets. This is really about eliminating wet markets, quite frankly.
It's about eliminating commercial trade in wild animals,
right,
and investing in nature protection. It's that simple. We take care of Mother Nature, she'll take care of us.
Wow, that's great. To your knowledge, just based on what you know today, and I know you've been a strong advocate for this, do you see any sort of momentum behind any sort of a global policy shift around this stuff, or are we still kind of not facing realities here?
We're in trouble. We monitor this very closely, and in spite of all the evidence of where these zoonotic outbreaks come from and how simple it is to maybe not eliminate them, but seriously reduce the risk and the intensity. We're seeing money and misunderstandings drive the debates. You don't see too many people talking about wildlife trade or destruction of wild habitat when they talk about COVID-19. They're talking about vaccines.
Not at all.
The conversation's all about vaccines. I mean, those are super expensive Band-Aids that you're going to need to change again. And I don't get it, except, this is all I work on now. So I have to remember that, people are just busy and they're worried about getting COVID and they want that vaccine. But, so no, we don't see the debate. We don't see leadership. We see answers, solutions. One Health is definitely the answer. We need to see governments picking up on it and show it and leading by example. And right now, I think probably that leadership is going to come out of Asia, and probably not at this point, not the United States.
One thing that concerns me, obviously from the perspective of what we do at the Jacobs Institute, is that it really is fascinating, this whole RNA approach to vaccine development. And it makes sense, and it's logical that we can develop these solutions a hell of a lot quicker than we have in the past. But I'm afraid that that's gonna mask the realities of the things that we talked about today. I really do. People are, going to get comfortable with the fact that we can potentially develop a solution, and that's not the answer. I mean, the answer to me, not only in terms of creating these viruses, but in terms of just protecting our planet, are very logical to me. And I just do not understand why we can't get more people to want to at least understand this perspective. I mean, and I applaud you for all the amazing work you're doing. It really is and can have a transformative impact on our planet and going into the future. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Well, no, I applaud you for having us on and talking about it. We've again, this whole discussion has been very siloed. So folks like you and I and others, we need to be talking together and forming solutions together.
I couldn't agree more, and we're certainly going to do everything we can. And I can't tell you how meaningful it is for us to have this collaboration and friendship with you here at the JI. So Stephen, unfortunately, I'm running out of time. As you know, we only have a limited amount of time. So I have a few rapid fire questions I'd like to ask you. And I first want to thank you for just what was a fascinating conversation. But if you don't mind, so that our listeners can get to know you a little bit better, I just got a few questions. Can I fire these off to you?
Sure.
Okay. What was the last book you read?
Oh man, I've got 4 books on my shelf as we speak. I'm not a huge book reader, to be honest, but
that's okay.
The last book I read would have been a Roald Dahl book of short stories.
Okay. All right. How many countries have you traveled to?
About 75.
75. What's your favorite food? Well, that's a tough question.
I've become an Indian food lover. My wife's Indian, so Indian veg.
Okay. And last but not least, what is the first thing you're going to do after this pandemic is over?
I want to go home. I'm based in Thailand, but I'm from Wisconsin, and I never would have thought at the beginning of this that my home state would have become a global hotspot for this. So I've been very frustrated not to be able to go home.
Well, I hope that you can get home soon. And I want to thank you. On behalf of all of our listeners and our colleagues at the JI, Dr. Hopkins, and the whole team there. It's been a great discussion. And really, thank you so much for being with us today. And I look forward to the next opportunity to speak with you. And I wish you nothing but the very, very, very best in your quest to get the world to understand that there is a solution to resolving these crises. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Bill.
And to our listeners, to the next time, stay safe and good day.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to be the first to know when there is a new episode, make sure to subscribe and recommend to a family member, friend, colleague, or your social media followers.